Hello, everyone. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Alexander King is a game designer and professor based in Brooklyn, New York. His work centers on data-driven design and simulation. And he was the systems and economy designer for the recently released Apple Arcade launch title Dear Reader. He's also made games about making emotion using only your face, which I would totally suck at. So, but here's our next speaker, Alexander King.
Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm going to be talking about artisanal procedurality, a phrase that will make sense in time as I explain these things. As Chris said, I'm Alexander King. I'm talking about Dear Reader, but to introduce both of those things to you. So my name's Alexander King, and I make games, but I'm not so much involved on the narrative side. If a ludology, narratology war were to break out immediately, I would take a moment before picking sides. So I'm setting my allegiances before you, because I didn't always make games. There was a time when I was a analyst, and I made things like this. This is a reporting dashboard, and I was too lazy to change out the data. So this is real data from 2013. Don't tell anyone. But it didn't stick. I'm also dating myself in this picture, not because of the size of the screen, but because I was given a cubicle. If this were today, it would be an open floor plan. That's how you know it's a vintage office. And so now I do things like this. This was a procedurally generated cellular automata synthesizer game that was played on a concert hall in Reykjavik earlier this year. And as Chris mentioned, I teach at the Parsons School of Design and the NYU Game Center in New York, and I teach game design and game development, and also like some weird classes that I made up, like math for game designers and economics for game designers. So that's my background. But I am here to talk about books, a game called Dear Reader, which is a commercial game that I worked on that was released recently. It is a word puzzle game that procedurally generates puzzles using the actual text of public domain literature. It was one of the launch titles for Apple Arcade, which I am contractually obligated to mention, is a recently released service on Apple products. It is $4.99 a month, and you get access to a curated selection of wonderful games. It's free for the first month, and so if you're an Apple customer, you should check out Apple Arcade. I think I've done my due diligence. And it was made by a local number 12, which is a company in Brooklyn, New York. And I wanted to point out, everyone on here except our two developers are involved in academia in some way. Almost everyone's a professor of game design or in some way involved in academia, and that sort of translates into a lot of the weird aspects of our game. It was in development for almost 7 years, all in, myself for the past 3, which is highly unusual for any game, but a mobile game most of all. And when working on a game isn't your full-time job, you have some disadvantages, but you also have this advantage of time, that we could just test things for long periods of time because we didn't have this sort of time pressure to get it out the door. So about the game. So we use actual books, and so I was super thrilled to be here in a library talking about our game is really a dream. So there's 50 books in the game right now. We're going to triple that over the next year or so. And you pick a book. So like Pride and Prejudice is the book you start off with, and then you are playing/reading through the actual text with these sort of procedurally generated puzzles where the words are scrambled up in some way. So the solution to the puzzle is always the completed text. In this mode swap that it's showing, some of the words have been rearranged, and you have to put them back into order. So it's one of the things that's sort of neat about the way that this plays is it gives you kind of this weird word level view of the work that English grammar is a clue to solving a puzzle, but won't help you all the way because real authors don't always adhere to the strict rules of grammar. And so you sort of get this odd sense of how an author uses words because you have to start intuiting like how would Austen have ended this sentence or something like that. Someone described it as like the sense of playing music that you get from Rock Band or something if you're not a musician. It sort of lets you role play as someone who understands music. It's sort of similar, you get to like role play as a writer. You get to think of how sentences are structured. So at this point, I would clarify that it is like just a game, just a normal fun game, not an educational game or a game that is intended to make you learn books or something like that. I clarify that because the association between reading and learning and education is so strong culturally that some people cannot accept that like we would make a game about books just for fun. It's like, wait a minute, you're trying to teach me something. You're going to try and teach me words, and we no, it's just for fun. It's just a fun book. But hopefully in a setting like this, in a library, we can accept that books are fun in and of themselves. They don't have to be educational. And I also wanted to note real quickly that for almost all of its development, it was known as Lost Words, a completely different name, and we had to change the name like 2 months before it came out. It's always just amazing when you get to do that and lose any sort of association with any brand recognition that you might have had. So you may have heard it under that name. So that's the sort of gist of how the game works, where you are you're reading the actual text of works and you're getting these puzzles. So artisanal procedurality. I wanted to talk about sort of the design challenges of working with actual text, the actual text of literature as a sort of building block for making puzzles in a game, and some of the kind of design challenges from that. So we ended up needing a sort of mix of design approaches. So I'm defining some terms here of like artisanal design, things that are handcrafted, versus procedural systems, things that are generated on the fly, and why we sort of ended up using a mix of both approaches and both algorithmic design and traditional design. So I'm defining artisanal design as like you are doing the design yourself. The normal, we would not usually have a word for this sort of design. Things where designer is building things in the game. And procedural as that some sort of algorithm or series of some sort of computer assisted process is doing the design for you, and that they have these pros and cons. And procedural design is always like this seductive sort of approach because you could have infinite content, all the books, all the puzzles, all the game forever, infinitely. But that it also has all of these drawbacks. It's super difficult to balance and it can end up being more labor intensive sometimes than actually doing it yourself. So here's why we sort of need both of these approaches. There's a real challenge to working with actual public domain literature. So we have real book text in our game. It's the actual books. So something like Alice in Wonderland, we're using Project Gutenberg scans of these books, and so there's some work right there. All the book text needs to be cleaned and sort of made ready for our game to use it. Over the course of this project, I got really good at regex. I can like clean all the book text and stuff now. But to turn a book in a real life book into a book in our game, we have to do more than just clean it, because there's a lot of words in books, and too many for our game. So Alice in Wonderland is 27,000 words, give or take. A single level in Dear Reader, which is about 5 to 7 pages, is about 100 words, because the screen's a lot smaller, and you need to be able to move the words around to play it, and so it can't be the reading sized font. And so if it were the full text of Alice in Wonderland, you would be playing it for forever. It would take, it's too much text. So we need some sort of way to use snippets of this content. And we also can't hand design all of the puzzles in the game. Would also not be feasible. Again, because even though we're only taking a portion of the book, you're sort of reading the greatest hits chapters of it. To design all the puzzles would also be, we would be designing it for another 10 years. It would take us to design all the puzzles, because you don't just play through the text of the puzzle. They're generated on the fly, and we have over 20 different kinds of puzzle. So we didn't sit and decide what words to swap or something like that. It would be too labor intensive. We'd be designing 20 different games per book, and you know, it's just not possible. And additionally, we have the same puzzle being applied to the same text. As you play the game longer, the challenge increases, and so a chapter that you played when you first started playing, if you play it later after you've completed 10 books, the puzzle will be harder. And so obviously there was no way we could have done all of that by hand. We need some sort of procedural solution to that. So I want to show kind of the way that we approach this in regards to just a single facet of the design related to difficulty as kind of an example of our approach to this. So some of our artisanal or hand design aspects of the game include the books that we have available to you. It's not just I don't know, all books ever or something. It's a hand curated selection of books that we curated, and curation was an actual task on the game. I don't know very many games that have a lead book curator as a position, but Mehek Khan was our literary curator, who's a postdoc in post-colonial, post-colonial. Or she might be a current PhD. There's too many posts in post-colonial literature at UC Berkeley, who helped us find a good selection of books, both in terms of the kind of gameplay affordances that we wanted, but also we're restricted to using things that are in the public domain globally. So we need books that are free to use in every country, and so. If you're looking at literature from before 1923, you start to run into some representation problems pretty quick, and that a lot of the most famous ones are white dudes who write in English. That's super overrepresented in that data set. And so working with a literary curator helped us find things to have a more balanced representation, or to comment on that lack of representation. Like, we're able to frame Tarzan as a colonialist work and stuff. So something you might not normally if you picked it up as a children's book. That also led us to find a lot of sort of hidden gems that are not the typical kind of public domain greatest hits, but were things that we uncovered through our research. Like my personal favorite on the top right is Arctique by Anna Adolph. Is sort of a journey to the top of the world, the Jules Verne. It's an American woman builds an airship in one paragraph. She wants to go to the North Pole, so she builds an airship, flies there, and it's a magical fairy society feminist utopia. They're like super ahead of its time, 1898 work, and so we got to find sort of cool things like this. So this is all handcrafted design, long meetings discussing the kind of works that we want to have in this game. And then we curate from those books. So, like I said, we don't have the entirety of the book in the game, and so we have a content management system where our literary curator or literary curators can log in and add the chapters from the books that they're going to use. So this is what it looks like for Alice, and so that we can check that the length is right, that it's going to make good puzzles and things like that. So we're curating the selection of books, and we're also curating the sections from those books that we're going to use for puzzles, which also had some knock-on effects of it lets us avoid things the kind of text that doesn't work for this kind of puzzle, like back and forth dialogue. Doesn't lots of short sentences, and it's hard to follow when we like good paragraphs are sort of what the game wants. And so we're able to handcraftedly curate that. And we also sort of obviously hand designed the kinds of puzzles that are in the game. We didn't I don't know, like use a neural network to procedurally generate kinds of puzzles. Nope, we literally hand designed them. Like we just played around with Scrabble tiles and kind of what would make for interesting ways to deconstruct text and what was fun to put back together. And there was a lot of playtesting of those to make sure that like you were sort of having the feeling of being an editor or something like that, and not the feeling of being like a spell check function on a word processor, like things that were too rote and boring, and sort of selecting for just the kind of puzzles that we wanted. So the other thing that we want is that the game should get harder as you progress. So one of the things that back 3 years ago that was a huge problem for us was that the uneven difficulty of the game. So if we were just using sort of, I don't know, random selections of the books, we couldn't control for how difficult it was at any one stage. And what we want is that a level or a series of pages should start out easy and then get more difficult, sort of a crescendo of difficulty, and then you're ready for the next level. So you'd think that would all be procedural. That's the part we're handling procedurally. But in fact, it's mostly hand defined. So for all the 24 different kinds of puzzles and another 6 if you sign up for Apple Arcade over the next 6 months, I've got to. We hand defined all of the breakpoints of what defines difficulty for each mode. So with the one where lines are swapped, it's going to be numbers of lines is kind of the difficulty variable, and so where do we want that to be at different points? And all of this is hand defined. So we have all these breakpoints defined by hand. So all of these are artisanal elements of game design, but there's also a lot that we can't hand design, as I said, that's sort of outside the scope of what we're able to do, and these are elements that we're handling procedurally. So the breakpoints of like what defines a puzzle being difficult, we define by hand. But then it's applied on the fly. So every time that you play a puzzle into your reader, it's generating that puzzle the moment you hit play. They're not stored in any way. What we wrote is an algorithm for picking different words. How many words should it switch? What kinds of words should it switch? This was itself lets us have sort of infinite numbers of puzzles, but was enormously labor intensive to have a system that can generate puzzles like this well. I pity the game designer who will try and clone our game, because the amount of little it turns, you swapped I with I. That's not a good puzzle. It's really hard to really tell anything's been done. The number of weird edge cases for handling language as a design for puzzles is enormous. But it does do it now on the fly. So it's picking which words to switch, and so that lets us do things like have the same text. You can play through the same level and it be completely different each time that you're playing it, because of all of these difficulty tiers are being interpreted by the game each time that you play it. The difficulty ramp through the chapter itself is procedural. So this is one of our internal spreadsheets, as my mother tongue is spreadsheets, where we sketch out, here's how over the course of a chapter, I want the difficulty to not just go up linearly, it's like a sine wave. So it has like a nice little, it gets a little harder, then a little easier. It's game design. And so all of that is mathematically defined, so that we get just the difficulty curve just so, and to account for chapters of varying length. Some authors have very short chapters. There are some that are very long, and so we needed a way to have a kind of scaling difficulty that would work with all sorts of different kinds of books. A note on this is that I really pity this website that tried to write a guide for the game as it came out, and these are here are the answers for Flatland. It's like, oh, poor buddy. It's not. It just when they fire it up again, I think they're going to be really disappointed that their walkthrough is not going to work. And then we also have these levels called twists that we've written all of these procedural rules for text, so now we can just apply them any way we want. So a twist is they're like boss levels, but procedural boss levels. And so we can do stuff like, oh, you have to play the chapter backwards, or something like that. Since we wrote this whole system to handle these these rules, then we could play with those rules to make the game harder. And so the twist itself is a whole procedural system when it applies. Like, when should the player be served up one of these twist levels? Is it done entirely procedurally? We just have rules about have they had one recently and stuff like that. How long have they been playing to determine if they should encounter one of these hard levels. And then I guess there's also aspects of the design that are not artisanal or procedural, that are not designed. They're just things that we have to kind of account for. Like, one would be the intrinsic difficulty of the text itself is not something that we can control. So we noticed that things like poems, particularly works in translation, so like Sappho, are much more difficult than prose writers. So plays and poems are harder than fiction. And so we have no way to kind of account for that in our system, so we just mark it to the player that some books are hard, and we have a little tag for hard and expert books. So there are things always outside of design that we just sort of have to account for. And then the other is sort of like player skill, player selected difficulty. We found that some people, if there was a time pressure in the game, that they hated it, that it immediately made the game stressful and unfun. For other players, if there's no time pressure, there is no game, because they could take as long as they wanted. And yeah, just spin your wheels on that for a year, and then we were just like, fine, we'll just let players choose. That's the easy way to solve that problem. So players basically just get to pick if there's time pressure or not. And so this is sort of I wanted to demonstrate kind of the mix of strategies in order to get to something like a game where we're using actual narrative, like you're reading actual classic works, but that are procedurally deconstructed, and then that makes the puzzle. That's how the puzzle comes out, and that having a mix of strategies is sort of, I think, the right approach. That designers a lot of times get sort of overly invested in a theory, or like, oh, we're going to do everything in the game is procedural. It's going to be so great. But that part of the process of working on this really like unusual game was seeing that we needed a mix of strategies. That there was no silver bullet to working with real books. That we needed to kind of adapt all the different strategies that we had in order to get something where we could take the real classic literature and turn it into these puzzles. So that's my explanation of Dear Reader. It is not yet playable in our arcade, but maybe will be tomorrow when we find a Mac to put it on. Oh, it is? It'll be there soon. But in the meantime, I have bookmarks. This is appropriate, with all of our stylish mid-century modernism book covers on it that I'd be happy to give to you as well. Thank you very much.